love goes on, softly on. So don't be sighing or crying. Still live with our
So, welcome to another Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. I'm Scott R. Kaufman, and that is Steve Adwell, and we will be discussing Game of Thrones. We are on the, the fifth episode, The Wolf on the Line?
Yep.
I'll let Stephen kick us off with a little bit of film noir. Go for it.
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing that I find interesting about this episode is it very much, the through line of this episode is very much noir detective Eddard Stark, as he intends to get to this, mystery that, starts with a seemingly accidental death and ends up with a grand conspiracy. So, I thought the scene where he walks to the tent that has Sir Hugh of the Vale's body in it and talks with Sir Barristan Selmy very much has this Law and Order opening moment, where Lenny Briscoe has to have that line about, well, who holds the straws that determine the draw? And, we get, then it's sort of intercut with a nice little burst of humor, the scene with Robert tormenting Lancel Lannister, which is never not me. And then we get this great fight, the Mountain and the Hound, which is kind of one of the first action beats of this episode. Sort of signifies that we are starting to kick into higher gear. And of course, Sansa's adorably bad gaydar.
Yeah, that was. Yeah, she's pretty awful. I especially when right next to her, they're Littlefinger is sort of taunting Renly about his relationship with Lorth. Like, oh yes, you will have, what does he said?
When will you be having
your friend? Yeah, when will you be having your friend?
Yeah.
And she just completely misses that.
Yeah, and there's also a little bit of the relevancy to the investigation there, because if Eddard actually ever asked, or sorry, no, it's in the book, but it's not in the show. There's a bit where Jaime fights the Hound and loses in the joust.
Yeah.
And Ren says something along the lines of, it's a pity Tyrion wasn't here, because then I would have won even more money. And if Eddard Stark had turned around and said, well, what do you mean by that? And asked him about the dagger, then, the whole conspiracy comes tumbling down. But that didn't happen in the show.
No, I think people are having a hard enough time following the knife around anyway. I mean, there's the great little scene where Tyrion actually says, do you think I'd be dumb enough to assassinate someone with my own knife? It's just sort of a reminder of why he is being arrested by her in the first place.
Yeah, and just to talk about that scene, the one thing I like is that it does show Catelyn Stark being good at politics, that she can be deceitful when she needs to be, but there is sort of frustrating element of the fact that this critically important thread, like, hey, why did Catelyn Stark kidnap Tyrion, and who told her what, doesn't get really picked up on. And it gets interrupted by a second fight scene. It's another action beat. Although, one thing I'll notice is that we get very subtly this game being played between Tyrion and Bronn, where Tyrion mentions, his father and the Lannisters always pay their debts, and he's looking at Bronn to see if he's picking this up, and they start to develop their kind of bromance.
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely starting there, and it's one that will we'll be talking about as it goes on. But what's really interesting about that scene is, and I know I've talked about this on previous podcasts, but I'll mention it again, is this episode is not just about conspiracies, it's very much about circles. The circles that are everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You begin with a bunch of wolves surrounding a lion, with, the Starks, with Tyrion in the middle, and the Stark people, or the Bannermen, and then you end with a bunch of Lannisters surrounding Ned.
Circling.
Yeah, and you also have the scene where a bunch of, where Baratheon is like leaving Ned out of the circle. Literally, they're filming it in a long shot with them around the table, and then Ned standing apart from it. Even the small council, even those. So the whole sort of inside-out dynamic of really is really interesting. But what's really neat is when that first circle breaks down, when Tyrion's in the middle. It's only because of the fact that the circle on the outside didn't realize that there was another larger circle around them,
right,
of the hill people. They thought that they were the ones in control, and then the moment where I think Tyrion really looks to Bronn is in that melee, as people are trying to approach him and Cat. Bronn, photo ass bombs the scene. By which I mean his ass actually. We're on a close-up of Tyrion and Catelyn, like huddled together, and all of a sudden this ass just comes right across the screen, and it's Bronn's, and he's fighting everyone off of them, and so that also seems to be a kind of he was testing the waters earlier, but now he sees that this guy's he can be bought, and this is what he can do once bought.
Right. That he's a good investment, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, we move from there into two invented scenes that I think are kind of examples of how kind of not to do invented scenes. Like the scene with Bran and Maester Luwin. Although it is, well acted, it's incredibly clumsy exposition. They might as well be holding up a chart.
Well, yeah.
And then there's the scene with Jon and Roz where, on the plus side, it provides a little bit more equity on the full frontal nudity front in terms of finally having a man naked. It's not very good.
No, it's very poorly staged as well. It's almost as if they tried to put as much as possible, like in between the camera and the actors. So even though you have the brief flash of male nudity, for the most part, it's obstructed, as by Roz and the female,
right.
Which is a nice little kind of way of almost summing up the whole show, right? That you have an abundance of female nudity, and then this one little moment, but then we'll cover up the male nudity with more female nudity.
Right.
And speaking of male nudity, the other main male nudity scene has no male nudity. The actual male homosexual sex scene, no nudity at all.
Well, I mean, from the waist up.
I don't think that counts as on men. I don't think that counts as nudity. Certainly not according to the FCC.
Is pretty intimate.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things that I always talked about with my students, is just how tender a moment that is, and how we have the homosexual relationship being portrayed versus the heterosexual. So the heterosexual, Theon and Roz, is being portrayed as literally a monetary transaction that he tries to turn into something more and fails to do, versus the very sort of intimate scene between Loras and Renly. That it's a sort of touching, no pun intended, kind of scene where we're starting to finally understand who Renly is and why he might matter. He gets a lot of face time in this episode too.
Yeah, he does, and they want people to see that he is a player in the story and what his relationships are, because that's going to be critically important starting in well, I mean, it ends very much in the episode where King Robert dies, but then especially in season 2.
Yeah.
They're good at foregrounding characters ahead of time to make sure you know who they are. So then, after we have these two invented scenes, we get another great classic noir beat where Varys comes in as Edd's confidential informant, and sort of talks darkly about, oh, there's all of these conspiracies, and doesn't actually give him a whole lot of good intel.
No, he seemed to
I mean, if you
simply.
actually look at what he's saying.
Yeah, but what he seems to mostly be doing in that scene is just trying to indicate to Ned that he now considers him trustworthy. Now, obviously, that itself is a ploy.
Yeah,
Go on.
as we'll see in the very next scene.
Yeah. But it's a.
But, at the same time... Sorry, go ahead.
I was to say, it's a nice little moment when we get to see Varys as he's walking around, closing all the blinds.
Yes, yeah.
Like it's this almost domestic scene, and given that when I think of like the classic film noirs, there always is this weird sort of odd domesticity to these encounters because they're almost always taking place in someone's living room or in their parlor or in their apartment, right?
Yeah.
And so that just sort of hammers home the idea that this is a very sort of playing with noir themes, such as the invasion of the private by the public, ironically by someone who's called a private detective.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on.
So, the useful thing is that, Varys does confirm for the first time that Jon Arryn was murdered. And he throws out a possible candidate for who did the murder, but, definitely hinting to the fact that there are greater conspiracies at work. And then we move to an example of greater conspiracies at work, as Arya chased a cat down into the basements with the skulls, which I thought were quite nice looking. And what's interesting about the scene is it is a moment of unintended total honesty. Right, here we have two characters who are some of the most conspiratorial, some of the people who are least sure about their motives, talking only with one another about what's going on because they believe themselves to be completely unobserved. And also a moment where the otherwise separate storylines of, Westeros and Essos finally link up. And you can see what's going on. And what I kind of wanted to lay out for our viewers is the tricky planning that Varys is going on. Is carrying on, which is that I think his intention here is he's trying to the reason he talked with Eddard is he is trying to get Eddard to slow the pace towards civil war somewhat. In part because he thinks that events are proceeding too quickly, that Drogo and Daenerys are not ready yet, and when Illyrio tells him, well, that's not going to work, they're not going to move fast enough, this is where it gets set up, the assassination attempt.
Yeah.
That Varys will go along with an assassination attempt which he controls completely. And I think that's something that people don't always quite cotton on to, is that what happens between Daenerys and the wine cellar later on is very much a bit of mummery. It's a bit of play acting, because Varys has agents on both ends that he's controlling. And it's very much meant to change this whole schedule. And then we get, once that meeting is over, we get this great scene between, one of the first of the great scenes between Littlefinger and Varys, where they're constantly going back and forth, which, again, it's an invented scene, and it's very good. And I think it's an example of how to do invented scenes in a way that give actors a chance to kind of show off a little bit in terms of their craft, but also explore the characters a little bit more. The Littlefinger's sexual fixations, for example, you get very much to see a difference in their styles.
Well, yeah, and the way that Varys is able to sort of needle Littlefinger is sort of interesting, because we've seen Littlefinger, prodding other people and trying to get a rise out of them with great success. But this is the first time we've actually seen someone turn the tables around and actually kind of manipulate Littlefinger. And of course, I think it's also important to remember that this is all taking place immediately in front of the Iron Throne, in the throne, like
right.
I mean, because that's where you want to have a very secretive conversation in the right
middle
at the,
of the
yeah, literally at the seat of power. But no, it is a very sort of well done little scene, and their back and forth. I don't think we actually learn much in terms of content so much as style. I mean, we're learning not anything concrete about them, but of how they manipulate people.
I mean, yes and no, in the sense that their conversation about the brothels, and Littlefinger's kind of libertarian ethos when it comes to matters of sexuality is a little bit revealing, and in the sense that he's a kind of a weird. I mean, as much as Varys is sexually othered by being a eunuch, Littlefinger is a little bit sexually othered in the sense that he's an unmarried man who deals in sex professionally, but we've never seen actually express sexual interest in anyone attainable.
And it seems almost the opposite. I mean, it's weird that you put it libertarian. I guess that works, but he's just more, I would say, a brazen capitalist. He just
libertine?
doesn't care. So, yeah, well, no, I would say, I don't know, pragmatist. It's going to make, it's going to make him the most amount of money, so he will, make sure that he has some good-looking one-legged women and, available should his customers require one. But yeah, I found that really a moment where style was trumping.
And it's also, well, although they thing in there that will play out later, where it talks about beautiful corpses.
Yeah, I guess the way that I always thought about that scene is it's an odd sort of counterpart to Syrio and the Knights in about 3 or 4 episodes, because it's a different. Littlefinger's much more in the Syrio role, whereas I mean Varys is just like whacking away at him, right?
Right.
Oh, what about this and this, and what if I have this sexual proclivity? And then Littlefinger's just sort of parrying, much as Syrio. It's a different way of rhetorical wielding of power, I guess is one way to put it.
And then we move from that scene into what I would call the badge on the table moment. With Eddard as the rogue cop and Robert Baratheon as a particularly belligerent police captain. And what's interesting is they've changed the scene slightly from the books to emphasize that more. So in the book, Sir Barristan is there at the council meeting, and he votes with Ned. So it's not, let me see, Renly, Littlefinger, Varys, Pycelle,
Robert.
So it's not 5-1. It's 5-2, which gives a slightly different flavor to it. But I've also described this moment as kind of the potential turning back moment that happens in good tragedies. Because Eddard at the moment is planning to get the hell out of King's Landing, and it's only when Littlefinger shows up and tells him about one more bit of evidence that he puts off his ticket out of town. And if he hadn't done that, then everything else that follows doesn't happen.
And I was about to say the exact same thing. That I thought you were still talking about the small council scene, and I was going to say no. The real your last chance moment is really that with Littlefinger and Eddard, because if he stops being a damn detective and just cuts and runs when the running is good.
Right.
Right. He's still alive. But
yeah, he's
curiosity
critically
gets the best
he's
of him.
not injured.
And
his children aren't taken captive. Robert's probably going to die, and there will be a War of Five Kings. But it's one that'll start with the Starks in so much better position than they would be otherwise. And what's really interesting is in the book, at this very moment when Eddard's planning on leaving, he says, "Well, Dragonstone is on the way home. What if I stopped in and visited? I should stop in and visit with Stannis." Stannis, of course, who knows everything about what was going on. Like, he is the prime witness that hasn't shown up. So, I love that hypothetical.
Well,
Counterfactual.
The one last thing I'll say about that scene is that the thing that really gets you in terms of Ned being the sort of stubborn detective is he doesn't need that evidence. He already has enough evidence. He doesn't need another one. Do you really think he? I mean, what does he get at?
He doesn't need the girl. I mean, he definitely does need Stannis at this point.
Oh no, he doesn't need the baby girl. He doesn't even need to see her. I mean, if what Littlefinger says was enough already. I mean, it was adequate.
Yeah, and it's important to notice that, like, Littlefinger is, when we next see this woman and her baby, they're in Littlefinger's employ. He knew about them episodes ago, and he clearly kept this one in reserve so that, like, if he needed to pull Eddard back in, he would have, a whole card.
Exactly. And Ned fell for it. For reasons.
I do want to talk a bit about, Catelyn arriving in the Vale, and, this is very much a difference in mediums thing. I really do, I'm sad that the Vale was truncated, because it is a fascinating example of world building that obviously couldn't make it onto TV because you'd have to build the sets of 4 castles instead of just one, and there'd be a huge climbing sequence that would be very expensive.
Yeah.
And I will say that I think the shot of Lysa and Robert Arryn, suckling at her breast at age 5 is still, that's what hits you. So.
Oh yeah, that's I would put that image up on the overhead in class, and I would just leave it up there and make them stare at it. Whenever I was talking about the role of nudity in the show, it's this sort of image of pornography that's not pornographic. It's meant to make you uncomfortable, right? It's not meant to titillate, and that in particular, and it's the second time we've had a weird moment involving breastfeeding in the show, because remember Garrett also, no, not Garrett, Raymer, taunts Will with breastfeeding.
Oh, right.
So and it's weird that breastfeeding ends up playing such a part of the show, because if you connect the Will, because Royce.
Sir Waymar Royce, yes.
Yeah, he's
the Vale.
Yeah, he's insulting. Oh, he was of the Vale? Okay, that makes his work even better.
The Royces are like the second most powerful family in the Vale.
Okay, so
and in the chapter, Catelyn meets his father in this chapter in the book.
Okay, because he's insulting Will for being suckled by his mother in the prelude.
And it's quite possible that Sir Waymar would have been in Lysa Arryn's court.
Yeah,
and seen this, and like that be in the back of his head.
Yeah, so that my theory is even better now.
Circles.
But yeah, because the implication is that Lisa should not be suckling him at all, not just at 5 years old, but period, because she is highborn. And so
Yeah.
there are two, right? There are two violations of the social code. Then, first, that she's suckling them at
Right.
all. Second, that she's still doing it this many years down the line.
Right. Okay, so one thing I want to bring up, because chronologically this is when the Renly-Laura sex scene happens. And one thing I did want to bring up is that the Renly in this show is very different from the Renly in the books. And you really get that in this scene because the Renly in the books is supposed to be basically a young Robert Baratheon who is a little bit more cultured, a little bit more aware of, you know, politics and public relations, and gay. And you never get the sense that he's the kind of person who would have to have it explained to him why it's necessary to be ruthless. I imagine that he and Loras definitely had conversations about him, you know, he should be the king. But I don't think that moment with the razor would ever have been necessary with the book Renly. But, you know, at the same time, I find the character that they've invented here to be quite kind of interesting and compelling in his own way.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of the things about, you know, especially teaching as I did in California, where sort of everyone has grown up around so many homosexuals. You know, they see that as a sort of perfectly normal thing. But I had to keep emphasizing to them the fact that, you know, he's on the one hand saying I'm fourth in line to the king, and another man and on the other hand he's letting another man put a sharp implement up against his. I mean, this scene would play out very differently, you know, in season 3 if it were Theon and Bolton, right? Like, yeah. So, I mean, but it's not. I'm not making any comparison between Loras and Ramsay Snow. I'm just trying to say that it's a similar kind of intimacy, right? The sort of the borderline between, I guess, you know, sex and torture. We're seeing it here with the knife blade being moved up and down Renly's body.
Yeah, I guess.
It's something that I think that it'll come to fore, obviously, more in later seasons. But it's a quite. I love the way it's shot. The series of kind of reverse shots of the two of them. It's filmed as a straight kind of, on the one hand, love scene. On the other hand, we've seen the similar shot selection and editing whenever someone is sewing up Sansa. Whenever, you know, it's putting on her dress.
Yeah, it's got that natural light, pre-Raphaelite thing going on.
Yeah, and so it's a. I thought that was very, very well done.
Yeah, and, you know, speaking of, and I think it points to the fact that, you know, invented is not bad. Invent can be very good, and this gets us to the scene with Robert and Cersei, which is a brilliant scene. You know, really giving Mark Addy and Lena Headey the chance to just kind of make this relationship so much richer than anything we get to see in the books, because in the books neither of them are point of view characters at this point, and you only see them in public when Robert is drunk and Cersei is scheming. You know, you don't sense that these were people who, you know, actually had like a day-to-day 7, you know, proximity to one another.
No, and it's especially great in terms of how Brian Kirk is directing this scene. You begin with these long shots, and they're talking to each other across the table, but in a series of long shots. And as they actually become more involved in the conversation, we switch over to medium shots until we're finally looking at them both in close-up on the reverses, and that's when they say "our marriage" and start laughing. I mean, literally, "our marriage" is the punchline of the joke. Our marriage is a joke, right? They start laughing.
It sort of failed, you know, right after you see kind of functional intimacy.
Yeah, and then from that moment, the camera starts moving back out from close-ups to mediums
Right.
back to long shots until at the end you have the long shot of Cersei walking away. But it was a sort of neat little play on camera, play on intimacy with the literal movement of the camera.
Yeah, and then we get what you could call the Chinatown scene where Jake gets his nose cut by Roman Polanski. This is, or in any Dashiell Hammett book, as a third way through the show, the hero gets like beaten up in an alley or something.
Yeah.
And what I like is that in the book, this has a noir feeling in that it's raining. Ned's depressed. He's very much kind of in his head and inner monologuing. But what you don't is the fight between Ned and Jaime. And why I like that as an innovation is that you never get to see Ned at his best. You hear about what he used to be like when he was a young man.
And we heard about it at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, we heard it at the beginning of the episode. Yeah. But, given that he's supposed to be in the mind, he's being built up as the protagonist in the minds of the watchers. It's important for them to have a scene where he kind of steps into that standard fantasy protagonist for a second, just so that they don't come away with this image of Ned Stark as kind of a hopeless sap who, was doomed to failure. And get a sense that this is a guy who could genuinely hold his own, who just happens to get really, really unlucky.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that it wasn't raining actually is just in terms of the palette, and it's weird that I mentioned Chinatown before we got started, and we're using that as a baseline because King's Landing actually sort of looks the way that Polanski shot Los Angeles in Chinatown in the 30s. It's that very yellow orange color scheme. But
it looks like it's hot.
Yeah, but we have that at the beginning of, or like there's no water. But at the beginning when we have that extreme long shot, the establishing shot of Ned walking across the, we have that palette established, and then at the end of the episode, it reappears on the outside of Littlefinger's brothel. And they do really seem to pay attention to the bookends of different episodes. And we'll talk about that more going forward because we're about to get to a couple of episodes where the bookends are structurally really, really significant. But I think that's why they decided not to have it rain, because that would sort of ruin the balance of...
Yeah, that's part of it. I think also the fact that it's supposed to be raining and then a fight on horseback would have been incredibly difficult and dangerous to shoot. And especially keep in mind, this season of Game of Thrones was running at the same time that HBO's Luck was having all those horses die. So, the real game impinges.
Wow. I
didn't think about that. Like in the book, it's meant to be something of an anticlimactic moment that the Ned and face, but don't actually fight. But for a show, it's a great climax to end an episode on.
Yeah, and it also, to go back to my little pet theory, it reinforces the whole circular thing. It's much harder to do that on horseback than just to get a bunch of people to stand around in a circle.
Yeah.
The one thing I will say is that a lot of rain now that you see on television is post-production rain. It's not actually on set. I don't know. I can't think of many raining scenes in Game of Thrones until the third season when they clearly would have had enough money, like in Harrenhal and stuff. Harrenhal there. Right there, it's always raining.
What about early season 2, the shot of Robb in a line of horsemen getting ready to attack, and it's sort of pissing. How did they get that wet look on everybody without actually, or do they just make everyone soggy wet ahead of time?
And then yep.
I see.
I was told that by a friend of mine who used to do TV series, and he mentioned that when I said something about the palette when it was raining in a particular episode because it was on this particular series, and I won't name it, but it took place in either Boston or Portland, and it was always raining there. And I actually asked him, I was like, how do you shoot around, the rain? And he said, oh no, we don't. Most of that stuff is like on set, on studio, and we put the rain in later. And I was like, really? Digital rain in Portland? You couldn't find any natural? So yeah, that's just a little useless bit of trivia.
Cool. So I guess we're done, leaving it at our injured. Although I will ask, have you seen the lightsaber version of the duel complete with John Williams' score?
I have not. I'll definitely add that to the.
Yeah, add that to the show link.
Yeah, because I really love that kind of stuff. Someone just sent me a Game of Thrones series of commercials that someone made for different products using stolen moments from Game of Thrones. But I haven't had a chance to watch it, so I don't even know if it's any funny. But if it is, I will add it. If it's not, I'm sorry, I just wasted 30 seconds describing it. All right, well, that is it for The Wolf in the Line then, I guess. It's weird that as the episodes are getting better and more compelling, our podcasts seem to be getting shorter. But I think we were overcompensating for the sort of world building of the early episodes.
Yeah.
But all right, so I guess we will talk to you next week.